Welcome to Glass In Session. I'm your host, Val. Happy 2024, one and all. I hope you had a wonderful holiday season. I hope you celebrated responsibly and that your new year is off to a bright and shiny start. And if anything, may this episode offer some sparkling cheer as well. You know what else can make life sparkly and wonderful? Champagne. Champagne can do that. Now, I understand that some of us are doing a dry January, but I had a few dry months last year, as many of you know, so I don't let a calendar tell me when to go dry any more than I let a clock tell me what time I can have a glass of wine, know what I'm saying? That said, I totally respect the culture of cutting back. I've had to recently, as booze doesn't pair well with some of my meds, and I've been on post-stroke and all that. So please don't shame anyone for doing dry January. And if you are doing dry January, please don't shame anyone who isn't. These are personal choices we all have to make for ourselves. So whatever you're sipping, whether it's bubbly water or bubbly booze, I'm going to raise my glass to that right now. And while I don't believe in dry January, I do believe champagne's story, and it's not just the shimmer of the glass or the bubbles on the tongue or its bonkers pairing with just about anything salty, fried, or hell, anything except for my meds. The story of champagne through the centuries is what makes it even more special when popping a cork of this favorite fizz. So if you clicked play on this, you're ready to go. And to tell that story, I've decided this is going to be a two-part celebration of champagne. It's going to stretch over 2 January episodes. So how's that for dry January? Part 1 today will cover the history, region, geography, got a little cork dork alert for you and a little dirt at the end. Part 2 later this month will break down the regions just a little. We're going to get into the appellations, the styles, the grapes, the production, and all that nitty gritty. There are so many goodies to stuff up into both of these episodes. I thought it was best to break it up. So pour a glass, sit back, unless you're driving, and let's get into it. We start by getting our geography on. The Paris Basin, y'all. Champagne's 34,200 hectares spans 3 regions, 5 départements, and 319 villages. It is the northernmost of the French wine-growing regions, 90 miles east and south of Paris, and one of the most northerly in the world, and coldest. It is between 49 and 49.5 degree north parallel. Remember, vines generally grow between the 30th and the 50th parallel, so we're all the way at the northern edge. Now, with global warming, we'll head thee back across the English Channel and see what's bubbling over there. The episode's linked if you're curious. But, for the sake of this episode, we're still at the northern-ish limit for growing vines. The climate is continental with some maritime influence from the north harsh winters. We're going to have moderate to cool summers. It rained a lot while I was there in October, and it was a little cool on those very rare sunny days. But, it's October. It's harvest time. That's just the way it is. Of course, dangers do include early autumn frosts or late spring frosts, which are countered by either sprinklers in the vines or chaufferettes. No, I didn't see any of those. Again, we were there post-harvest. But chaufferettes are they look like cans or like little stoves to kind of keep the frost at bay in the vines, but that's a way they counter some of the unseasonably colder temperatures. Now for some history. Let's begin with the Gauls and a tribe called the Remi, R-E-M-I. But when the Romans started ruling around 50 AD, the Romans kind of hogged all the vineyard plantings for themselves, and they really wouldn't let the Gauls plant their own vines anymore because they wanted the Gauls to buy their wine from the Romans. But either way, vines were here that early around the 1st century. You may remember from the wine cave episode, linked, that the Romans had also dug out all these caves below the ground, about 250, and they were these underground tunnels through the chalky soil of the Paris Basin. And don't worry, we're going to talk chalk later, do some chalk talk. And these crayères are about 100 feet deep. And what they were doing was quarrying the stone for building Roman things on the ground with all these caves underground. And this is the one aspect of champagne, I'm telling you, besides getting it in my mouth, that has fascinated me the most about the region. The chalk freaking caves. By the end of this episode, you'll know why. As we roll into the 5th century, the Romans, they're still ruling the place, aka Gaul, not quite France yet. They dominated an epic throwdown with Attila the Hun, aka the Scourge of God, between Troyes and Chalon-sur-Marne in 451 AD. Didn't see Attila the Hun making an appearance yet, did you? Surprise! I know. But yes, Roman Gaul, led by battle-hardened Flavius Aetius, a mighty warrior, he would hand Attila his first barbaric butt-kicking in decades on 20 June 451, because they heard he was on the move and they stood up an army, and it was crazy. I found a really cool article on it that you might enjoy reading over Kick Butt Bubbly later, linked in the show notes, but I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but I thought a barbarian was cool to add to the history. We got the Romans, we got Attila the Hun, we're going to have monks, we're going to have kings, we're going to have all those things we find in crazy wine history. I thought we should have some barbarians as well. But the Romans themselves would remain a dominant force in the region until the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire. King Clovis then would unite France, then Gaul, like I said. One of my favorite stories post-Roman domination was of King Clovis, king of the Franks, who rolled upon the place and united the various tribes under a single Gaul rule. He would be baptized in Rome by Bishop Remi, R-E-M-I, spelled the same way as the tribes, and he would convert to Christianity under one condition. If this God dude was real and he would help him kick some enemy butt, then I'll believe in all this hoo-ha and you can baptize away, Bishop. And the bishop was like, you're on, dude. So he blessed a barrel of the region's wine and he said to King Clovis something to the effect of, yo, as long as this cask has hooch in it, you will be the battle master of the universe. I mean, you will win all your battles. You know what I'm trying to get at here. Go on with your bad self. So King Clovis decided, hey man, this barrel never runs dry. This Christianity deal, this must be all right. And yay, wine. No, I really do love this story. And I know it's a little irreverent. My Catholic grandmother's looking down from heaven going, oh, honey, you know. But I also thought I remembered that this story happened on Christmas Day. And I didn't look really hard, but it wasn't in any of the notes that I had. And I still have a lot of notes from about 8 years ago when I did this course. But as I was walking around the cathedral in Rome back in October, I actually found a stone on the floor of the church. Yes, the church did not burn down, lightning didn't strike and all that stuff. I found a stone in the church that said, Ici, Saint Remy Baptista Clovis, Roi de Francs. So here, Saint Remy baptized Clovis, king of the Franks. I was floored, literally floored. And I took a picture of the stone tile in the floor and I thought, how cool. Did this really happen? And this is where they said it happened. And I'm standing in this gorgeous cathedral in the heart of Champagne thinking, no wonder St. Remy was promoted to saint. And yes, St. Remy was promoted to saint. From the 5th to the 9th centuries, as with other wine regions, it would be the church's involvement in viticulture and winemaking that would boost the progress of the industry, as it were. Benedictines were the only monastic organization in Europe for about 500 years until the 1100s. And then we have the Carthusians, the other orders of the Cistercians, and I talked about Templars and Hospitallers in the medieval wine Holy War episode, so I'd link that up if you want more information on what they have to do with wine at all. And then perhaps the episode does need a top-up because I was lunching at Lanson, as one does, a champagne producer, and I noticed that there was a Maltese cross on the bottles. And I'm not sure I discussed that in the episode, but it turns out that Lanson's founder was also a member of the Knights of Malta. And so when we talk about those holy warriors and what they have to do with wine, the story is long, it is rich, and it is interlinked throughout all of Europe. But as we're rolling into the Middle Ages, we have Troyes, T-R-O-Y-E-S. I believe they say Troyes, becoming the capital of Champagne. And we talked about them in the riots episode, also linked up. And somewhere along the line, the Counts of Troyes became the Counts of Champagne. So here we are, still in the Middle Ages, but we're starting to see that word champagne come around. And it should be noted that the primary economic engine at the time was not wine, it was textiles. Remember, Champagne is the place, and the wine is from the place. It's not yet bubbly, it's not anything close to what we think of today, but it was there. By the 9th century, these wines of this place, this region, Champagne, would have names. 2 names in particular. There was Vin de la Montagne, the wines of the mountain, and they were kind of, I've talked about the color of the eye of the partridge before, l'œil de Padri. These were the Gouais Noirs. These were made with the Gouais Noir grape. And then we had the Vin de la Rivière, made with Fromenteau, which is today's Pinot Gris. Now, these were more pale onion skin in color, or what we would call avant-gris today, and I've talked about those before. But we do have names starting to show up to describe the wines from different parts of the Champagne region. But as we go back to the Middle Ages and see that trade fairs are becoming more popular and that the textile industry is solidified by the 1100s, over 130 communes in today's Champagne region. These became viticultural epicenters as well, including Rome, Epernay, Chalon-sur-Marne, and Cézanne. As for these trade fairs, wine, of course, was drunk during the buying and selling of the leather and the spices and the wool and all these things that they were trading in the textiles. And I did learn that these were held a couple times a year and they could last more than 6 weeks. So it was kind of a festival. Then we moved to the 13th century, where King Louis VIII is the first of 27 kings crowned in the Rheims Cathedral. This means that every king for the next 600 years would be crowned there, Rome being a central city of Champagne history and culture, and to this day is a must visit, and I would have loved to have spent more time there. We just had an afternoon. I made sure I got into the cathedral, had a cup of coffee in the square, and just gawked at the people, but I mean, the historical significance of it is incredible. But unfortunately, the following 2 centuries would see the region ravaged by way of the 100 Years' War. By then, Champagne was battle central between England and France, and not only did it take its toll on the vine, but the people were ill, they were starved, the plague was around. But as we enter the 16th century, we see something that harkens to what we see today, Pinot Noir. It enters the vineyards of Champagne, mainly around Aix, and it would eventually replace the Gouais Noir as the popular red grape, even for the Vongris wines. It was during this time that Dom Perignon was born. And by then we realized that the wine, like I was there, by then we realized that this wine that was kind of like stopping fermentation for a winter pause as the weather got colder. I talked about this in the DY episode, which I linked. But in the spring, it was starting up again and it was starting that fizz. And some viewed this as a nuisance or divine intervention or the devil or evil spirits. But to the people of Aix, their sparkling wine was called Tocane, and they liked it, and the wines of Tocane were becoming popular. So the sparkling wines were called Tocane, but the wine wasn't yet called Champagne. Haha, just made that up. Anyway, then we enter the 17th century. The 30 Years' War would last until 1648, and the French Bourbons and the German Habsburgs were fighting this out. But after this, the Peace of Westphalia was signed, and this would declare Champagne to actually be French territory. And this is where we have to talk about England during this period of time. I know, what does England have to do with any of this? Well, they had several key roles in Champagne's history, if you didn't know. And we could start with the Navy, and I might have talked about this part before in a previous episode. James I decreed that non-essential wood uses, such as, glass blowing, those should be fueled by coal. Why? They needed to save the wood resources for building Navy ships. This was about the time where in the Age of Sail, remember the Age of Sail in the Madeira episode, that they needed to build up their armadas and what have you. And there was a lot of battle at sea happening. And the hotter coal fires, turns out, gives a stronger bottle glass. And this made British bottles a little bit more suitable for champagne, since the less stable French bottles often exploded, rendering it necessary to wear iron face masks. And there are pictures of that. It was then Sir Robert Mansell, who was not only an admiral in the Royal Navy and a member of Parliament, but an owner of several glass factories. Well, how about that? Because he had a monopoly in 1615. And by 1630, the English were already using this precursor to modern bottle glass, or verre anglais. As for the wine itself, they also had a role in this. In fact, they are credited with, and I'm going to use the air quotes, creating what we know today as champagne, because in 1662, Christopher Merritt submitted a paper to the Royal Society of London stating that English were already adding sugar or molasses to wines, among other things, to render them sparkling on purpose. That's right. They weren't sitting there looking at the bubbles going, oh my God, evil spirits, what's going on? They're like, no, we got this. We want them to sparkle. Because they would buy the stuff in the barrel. And by the time it got there to England, it wouldn't be sparkling or fizzy or anything. So they would add sugar or molasses to kind of start a second fermentation, if you will, to make them sparkle. Back on the continent, meanwhile, the French are still using masseurs, or like these wooden whisks. They were used to dispel the bubbles in the Pétillant wines and the Vongris. Bad bubbles, bad. But in 1668, Dom Perignon, by now, he's all grown up and he becomes a cellar master at Haute-Vière. Of course, there were going to be monks. You knew there were going to be monks, but he did not discover champagne. So I hate to burst bubbles. I know a lot of people say, oh, Dom Perignon discovered champagne, that whole drinking stars thing. Sorry to be the turd in the punch bowl of history here, but that didn't really happen, or at least there's no record of that happening. But his contributions were very important, even more so, and thusly summarized in a dissertation by Frere Pierre in the next century. His contributions had to do more with what we see today in champagne, press fragments, which we'll talk about in the next episode, and quality juice, as well as in the vineyard. We credit him with creating the blend, for instance, for integrating this verre anglais, or the strong English glass, and for integrating Spanish corks to contain the bottle pressure. But in the very last years of the 17th century, we find the first intentionally produced sparkling champagne, which were sealed with cork closures, reintroduced in 1685 to replace what they used to use. It was a wooden plug secured with string called a broquelet. Grapes grown in Champagne during this time, at the end of the 17th century, were, for the whites, Meslier, Gouais, Chasselet Doré and Arbonne, or Arbane, which we still have today. And the pigmented grapes would be the Gouais Noir, Morillon Noir, which is now Pinot Noir, Morillon Tacon, which is a Pinot Meunier, Morillon Hatif, which is an early ripening Pinot Noir variant, from what I understand, and Fromenteau, which is today's Pinot Gris. The sparkling wine was now on the radar and then was referred to as Vin de Champagne, or champagne wine. By the 18th century, yes, red wine is still popular, but the champagne industry was starting to find its momentum. And this is when it also became legal to ship in bottles, because sturdier glass, more uniform bottles made it easier to move these bottles around, not necessarily using the barrels like they used to. And this was important because before this, glass blower lung capacity would determine bottle size. Therefore, there was no uniformity. So in 1735, a royal decree mandated that champagne bottles must weigh at least 25 ounces and hold, and I believe the word was Paris pint. And I'm not sure what that is, but a 25-ounce bottle. Okay, we'll go with that. Cork was first again used during this time, and the cork makers from Spain came to Rome and Epernay to cash in and make those corks. And while we're on the subject of cork, let's just slide into our first cork dork alert of the year. According to Estelle Dupont, writing for Millésima USA, the average cork is 2 inches long with 1.2-inch diameter. Corks are not mushroom-shaped before jamming into the bottle, by the way. They're just in the shape of a cylinder. But by compressing that body of the cork 60 to 70% of the original diameter before corking the wine, we can see how the mushroom shape comes about. What's a cork made of? Cork. You knew that. But did you know that there are 3 distinct parts of a champagne cork? And this is easy. There are 2 cork discs that are stacked on top of each other. On the bottom of the cork, the disc closest to the wine is called the mirror. And then the body is just cork bits reconstituted, glued together, or agglomerate. And this allows micrograms of oxygen to flow in and out of the bottle over time to help with aging. Now, newer corks, like one I pulled out recently, have the words mytic diam, and I'm assuming that's how they say it, MYTIK-DIM. These not only help reduce the chances of trichloroanisole or cork taint, but they also don't break down as much over time or change their shape. You see, over time, all that pressure in a bottle, pressure in the bottle of bubbles does affect the cork. The mushroom shape with a wider bottom that looks like a puffy skirt, that's called juponnet, as the French word for skirt is jupe. On older bottles, you might very easily pull out a more peg-shaped cork, which I've done on several occasions. I thought, oh, this is great. This is one of those Chevier ones. It means that not only has the cork started to, I'm not going to say break down, but the structural integrity of the cork is somewhat compromised. So it doesn't hold its shape anymore. But you also might see less bubbles in the glass as the wine can lose some of its effervescence over time. It does not impact the quality of wine. It's just, hey, I've been in here a long time and I give up, and it just kind of comes out kind of straight instead of like puffy skirt looking, if that makes sense to you. I'm sure you can get that image in your mind. Yes, cork dorkalicious indeed. Let's get back to history. We are now in the 1700s, and this is when the first champagne houses were stood up, starting with Ruinart in 1729, which is fun because I got to visit it back in October, and I'm still in love with that whole day and those wines. But red wines were still popular during this time as well. And check this, additives during this time included things like alum, honey, cinnamon, milk, elderflower, and pigeon dung. Don't ask why. 30 to 80% of the sparkling bottles were still exploding. Remedies included everything from increasing ullage, which means more space in between the top of the bottle and the wine in the bottle. Cooler cellars. Of course, those chalk cellars are great for that. Surlat storage. This is laying the bottle sideways on these strips of wood. But we still had a way to go here, because science has to play a part in all of this. As we move into the 19th century, by 1821, we're looking at least 100 champagne houses versus like a dozen or so in the 18th century. And this would be about the time we would start hearing mention of using sugar to get the sparkle, and the breakage of the wine bottle is still being reduced. We still have stronger bottle glass. We're starting to figure out the pressure thing, but we still got about 10 to 20% breakage. About the 1830s, the coupe made its debut. Champagne was topped up at cognac at that time, but what better way to kick off Champagne's golden age, because that's where we are now. 1830 to 1870 is considered Champagne's golden age. And it was during this time we had a lot of things going on. So the dosing formula to help decrease breakage in the glass as far as sugar goes. So we didn't put too much sugar in there, so the yeast didn't go absolutely crazy because too much pressure, exploding bottles, all that. And it was also during this time that the muesli, you know, that wire cage that we untwist exactly 6 times when we're opening a bottle of champagne, it was developed by Adolphe Jacquesson and it was patented in 1844. That would replace that. Remember that I talked about the wood peg or the string seal that used to be dipped in wax or linseed oil or hemp oil or tallow. This was called ficelage, that string seal. So the muesli, which looks like a muzzle, because that's what it means, would be sliding over the top of that cork and sealing it shut to replace the string. And this was during, again, the 19th century. By 1850, red wine was still about 66% of production, but it was down from 90% in the first third of the century. And then we started looking at dry or sec bottlings for the US and UK markets, because a big buyer during this time was still Russia, and they liked them some sweet wine. But the markets in the UK and the US were like, hey, you know, we like a little drier. So we were starting to make our champagne a little, again, like I was there. So they're starting to make this champagne a little drier now. And then by 1856, the corks are covered with tinfoil versus wax. It was also during this time that the actual measuring of the sugar to feed the yeast, remember we were talking about those exploding bottles. Originally, this was done in the barrel by the British. Remember Christopher Merritt and all that. And it was a widespread practice in England before the champagne figured out how to control it in the bottle. And this had to do with contributions by Chaptal and Louis Pasteur's work on the role of yeast. So you see where science becomes involved. And by this time, we have a more controllable, deliberately induced, on purpose second fermentation to become common practice in the late 1800s. This includes accounting for the wine's ability to absorb as much of the carbon dioxide without exploding the bottles. All the pressure now shows up as sparkle in the wine, in the glass, and not bottles exploding in our face. And by 1894, I believe 4 grams per liter of sugar for 1 atmosphere of pressure was the formula. There were also campaigns during this time to place the name and the wine for name protection and protect against fraud and guarantee authenticity. There was a court of appeals also at the end of the century that declared that champagne can only be used in association of wines from that regions. And I think you heard me rant about that in the American Bubbly. In the American Bubbly episode. I'll link it up if you want to hear that. Remouage, dégorgement, these are things we're going to talk about in production, but they were essential to the art and science of champagne and bottle, and some of the best parts of the champagne production story. But they were integrated also during this time. And since this century started with war, thanks to Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte ended the century with Franco-Prussian War, all fought in, where else? Champagne. Hello, 20th century. By 1900, there would be quite a few varieties of grapes in the vineyard. For white, we had Chardonnay, Gouais Blanc, Pinot Blanc, various offshoots of that, Petit Meslier, Arbonne, and Chasselas Blanc. Then for the reds, we would have Gamay, Chasselas Rouge, Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Noir, and various varieties of Pinot Noir as well. And as the vineyards were recovering phylloxera, crafted vines would be planting, result in the types of varieties we know today, the ones I just talked about. And the vineyards would start to be planted in rows, much, again, like we see today versus what they used to call en foule. Yet I did get to see some, no kidding, ungrafted vines at Boulanger, and that was pretty magical. But by the numbers, pre-phylloxera, there was 150,000 acres in Champagne. Post-phylloxera, only 30,000 acres. So you can see how it decimated the vineyards even there. Now, the region is still very serious about marking the turf. In 1904, the Fédération des syndicats de viticoles de la Champagne campaigned against fraud. And then in 1908, the official borders were drawn. Well, as we know from the Champagne Riot episode that I linked up for you, the Aube was eliminated after the 1908 delineation, and they were not so happy, so they rioted. That's what they do. Then the decision was reversed, so the Marne rioted. So somebody was always getting left out of this agreement, and Aube was finally augmented as a second zone in 1927, then the region's demarcations were settled. If we go back to 1911, we can at least note that the Vin déclaré originaire de la Champagne viticole now is going to appear on shipping documents, mandating that champagne appear on labels, corks, and packing crates. In 1911, the échelle de cru was implemented. Échelle in French means ladder, and so this was a rating system that actually ranked the different villages and what the growers were going to be paid for their grapes per kilogram of yield. So the échelle means ladder. And so if you think of a pyramid, my favorite way to wrap wine quality systems, at the top, we have the Grand Cru villages. These would get the top price for the grapes based on the price set for that year. Next down on the pyramid would be the Premier Crus, who got Grand Cru at the top, then the Premier Crus, they'd get a little less, and the remaining villages under that would get a lower price still. Now, the actual words Grand and Premier Cru wouldn't be introduced for another couple of decades, but even with the dissolution of the Échelle de Cru systems in the early aughts, about 20 years ago, except for a few places, the Grand Cru and Premier Cru village designations remain. And last time I checked, there were, I want to say, 17 Grand Cru villages and 44 Premier Cru villages. But during World War I, we'd see the devastation of the vines and properties by the Germans, to include some of those actually owned by Germans who migrated to France a century before to seek their own champagne fortune. Mumm, for example, he was German, never got his French citizenship, so was rolled up by the French, imprisoned in Brittany, and the Champagne house was seized by the French until after the war. Now, I don't know why Champagne has to be the place where all battles are fought, but this seemed to be the history for hundreds of years. The death toll during World War I, of course, was massive, and I still can't get my head around Pommery taking almost 200,000 shells by 1916, essentially obliterating a once gorgeous property. Now, you can see pictures of this in the Claude Strup's Champagne book, and it's very sobering, and I did link up the details on this book, the full title of the book, if you want to read this book. It's one of their books, Wine and War and Champagne, are probably two of my favorite wine books in the world. Now, they are very sobering because you can see the Pommery Gruneau bomb damage, and you can also see Moet and Chandon, Clicquot, Ponsardin, and the Rheims Cathedral. Again, that was obliterated. And people actually living in those chalk tunnels or those crayères, like kids going to school, doing PT, even hospitals. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were quartered in the crayères. And those chalk caves that I so wanted to see in campaigns, the very ones that were dug out by Romans, rediscovered by monks in the Middle Ages as a really cool place to store wines, well, nearly 300 miles of those tunnels is where people went to try to survive, if not live a fraction of their lives, as the Germans were bombing the crap out of them on the surface. Now, the line that really struck with me from the decade since I've read the book Champagne is on page 178, and apparently the footnote says this is from the Pommery archives, but I quote, "Now, because of the shelling, it was as if Rome had been flipped upside down. Everything on the surface was suddenly underneath. Schools, churches, clinics, cafes. City Hall was moved underground, as were the police and the fire departments. Tailors, dressmakers, watchmakers, and cobblers all set up shop there too, along with butchers, bakers, and even candlestick makers." So this piece from the Pommery archives, it has stayed with me ever since, and it was one of the reasons I really wanted to see the chalk caves in Champagne. Not only are the wines being stored down there, but the history there is just incredible. Get the book, read it, as the story is more textured, more gripping than I can ever offer you by way of this podcast, but Mama needs a sip. Hang on. Whew. Okay, before I slip into World War II, I should note that Champagne has had many innovations in the interlude between Germany losing their damn minds again in World War II. The vineyards were planted once again, and with grafted vines. The official appellation was created, and in the winery, we're starting to see bottles that were from glass-blowing factories versus hand-blown showing up on the bottling lines, because these are more automated than ever. Glass blowing was automated. More things are being automated. So while the Great Depression and that silly prohibition thing back in America didn't really help things with the houses, we can say that smaller growers and co-ops did start to gather steam. That is until another freaking war. Again, trying to keep it on track here, but I want to throw one name at you that you might recognize from Argentina sparkling wine episode, linked, Robert Jean de Vogue. He was responsible for standing up Chandon, Argentina. Well, wouldn't you know it, this was the very same dude who was also part of the French resistance in World War II, in charge of Eastern France's political wing. Now, does that mean Moet and Chandon are World War II resistance heroes? In my book, sure, why not? They too, along with way too many houses to name, were pillaged, so let's do this thing. Long story short, de Vogue had been sentenced to a Nazi death camp, which I did not know. He did survive. In addition to escaping his original death sentence, he actually went on to found the CIBC, or the Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin de Champagne. And like I said last season, he was integral in spreading the classic method sparkling wine love to the vineyards of Argentina and standing up Chandon, Argentina. And a quick note on the CIVC that I just mentioned, it is a professional wine trade organization that protects the interest of the growers, the housers, and the producers. And it's like any other trade organization, but it is still very important to the regulation and the protection of the culture of Champagne. Now, there are many more stories to be told from these awful times, and in a way, the vineyards, the chalk crayères, the surviving structures still tell them to this day. To spew forth my last quote from my beloved dog-eared Claude Strup book, Champagne is about survival. I adore and agree with that sentiment. And I will just finish history out by mentioning in the 20th century, as with other wine regions, this rung in the age of modernization once all the wars were over with. So we rebuilt, we got new equipment in the vineyards, we got new equipment in the wineries like fermentation tanks and other automated production equipment. More houses were introducing what they called special cuvées. And this will sound familiar to you because you may have heard of Veuve Clicquot's Grande Dame or Perrier-Jouet's Belle Époque. Those were launched in the 1960s. Paul Roget's Winston Churchill was launched during the 70s. And none of this would have happened had it not been for the chalk. Mesdames et messieurs, it is time for us to have the talk. The chalk talk. You know, I rarely talk dirt on the show, but when it's special, you just gotta. The Paris Basin that I mentioned earlier, well, 90 million years ago during the Cretaceous period, as the dinosaurs were starting to go extinct, it was underwater. All of the accumulated fossils of sea creatures settled and created almost a bowl, or what is that word? Oh yeah, basin. Sometimes hundreds of meters deep. The White Cliffs of Dover, same chalk from fossilized marine critters during the same Cretaceous period. The specifics that stick in my mind, however, when I was studying for the Champagne Master Level certification are the belemnite and the micrastor chalks. Now these belemnite, micrastor are sea creatures. The reason they stand out to me is because, well, my husband's an amateur paleontologist. So when I was studying this, I went, hey, honey, you have belemnite? You brought one upstairs to me. So yeah, we got one. Got one right here in the house. It is preferred due to its mid-slope location. But the micrastor chalk made from the fossils of these little sea urchins from also the late Cretaceous period, these are found on the flatter plains or the flatter areas. And this just has to do with the place where it is on the hillside, whether the land was pushed up or whether it settled at a different time period. So neither one is better than the other, but I remember that the vines on the hills have to struggle, and that's where the belemnite is. So I thought that was just an interesting thing to point out. There was also something a little further south, the Virgulian or Kimmeridgian marl. These are little oyster comma-shaped thingies from the Jurassic period. So a little earlier, between 200 and 145 million years ago, these are fossilized oysters or Exogyra virgule. This is part of the Kimmeridgian ring that also surfaces in England, Normandy, Chablis, Loire Valley, and we'll chat more about this in the Chablis episode, but I brought it up because we do see the Kimmeridgian soil down in the Aube. Which one is best? Like I said, micrastor belemnite, same mineral structure. The main difference is just the location of the soils, sun exposure, drainage properties, all those things. See? Didn't hurt a bit. Chalk on the hills, more drainage. Chalk on the plains, less struggling for the vines. Bam. Now we know where Champagne comes from. The fascinating soil that the grapes grow in, a fraction of the history, and the cork, Dorkalicious morsel on cork. Next time, we'll pick up on how it's made, its beautiful story, the Cinderella bedtime story of the wine world, in my opinion, and we'll talk about the different styles and even other appellations of the region. For now, let's close out with a few end bits. According to Champagne's official website, there are over 16,200 growers. There are over 370 Champagne houses. In 2022, over 325 million bottles of Champagne were shipped around the world. In 2015, the chalk cellars, houses, and hillsides were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List as a cultural landscape. Damn right. Finally, if you're a follower of Bubblista on the socials, mostly Instagram is where I see her, she gives you some lovely Brut Nature and Extra Brut recommendations for her take on Dry January. Yep, linked up in the post, so you don't have to hunt it down. Thank you, Devon. Meanwhile, you can reach out to me between sessions. Email me at val@glassinsession.com. On the socials, I'm on Threads, Vino with Val, same as Instagram. You'll see Glass In Session in my bio. Glass In Session is on post.news@glassinsession. Glass In Session on Spatable. I just joined Blue Sky. I found 2 wine people so far, or 2 or 3. glassinsession.bluesky.social, bsky.social. Still looking for wine peeps over there. Not a lot happening over there. Mastodon, Glass In Session at epicure.social. I'm Vino with Val on Pinterest, and it's Facebook/Glass In Session. I still have the Wine Gal Unboxed Twitter account. I might have to look at it one of these days. But there is still Glass In Session, and yes, podcast swag in my TeePublic store, linked all the way at the bottom of the show notes and on my website, including the new Cork Dorkalicious teas, mugs, and other goodies. My favorite thing so far, besides the refrigerator magnets, is the grape-colored tri-blend female fit t-shirt. Very soft, but order a size or 2 up because they fit very tight, but they are flattering. Since I don't do sponsors or ad or Patreon, it is a small way to support the Winecast. And of course, keep my podcat Smokey here well stocked with treats while he sits here on my lap as I create this booze edutainment for you. Glass In Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Website is glassinsession.com.